For most of us, James Rodriguez burst onto the scene during the 2014 World Cup.
And James Rodriguez! He's a star, all right! A shining, glittering star! 2 weeks ago, just a precocious talent. Now, a global hit.
But since then, the Colombian playmaker has not really reached the ceiling that many expected he could reach.
James Rodriguez is capable of entertaining anyone who is willing to watch. The only problem is the left-footed player is experiencing an extreme patch of turbulence. What the hell is happening to the Colombian international?
This week, though, James took a new step in his career, joining Everton in time for the beginning of a new Premier League season.
We start with Everton. They've had a great few days. We brought you the news over the weekend that they signed Alan, and last night they added James Rodriguez for £22 million. We managed to get a word with James once his deal was completed.
Everyone knows that I hadn't featured too much in the first team last year, didn't get too many minutes on the field, but I'm dying to play. I know that I'm going to get chances to play here, and I can't wait to perform. I'm aware that Everton haven't won major trophies for a few years now, so I want to try and put that right if I can.
In this episode, we ask, how will James Rodriguez fit in at Everton?
It's quite a coup for Everton, isn't it?
Alex Stewart is Senior Content Strategist at The Athletic UK and covers tactics for Tifo football.
Previously, I suppose some of their other acquisitions haven't looked great, but James is a real step change in terms of quality, and with the recruitment of Alan and Decore as well, and looking at getting Tomori on loan, it seems like Everton are being really astute this window.
So just casting your eye down the career CV of James, it's a fairly curious assortment of clubs. It's interesting to note that he's never played at more than one club in any country, and his career has seen him go from Colombia through Argentina, Portugal, France, Spain, and now England, with a significant loan spell in Germany with Bayern Munich thrown in for good measure. What do you make of James' career trajectory?
It's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, the pathway out of South American football to Portuguese football is fairly well trodden, although generally speaking we expect that more of Brazilians. I think that was the time when Monaco were really flexing their financial muscles as well, so that big transfer to Monaco again makes sense. I think from that point on you're looking at a player who's established themselves as potentially a world-class attacking midfielder, but somebody who has other issues, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about in the future. But I think that's why he maybe stayed at those clubs for quite a long time but didn't actually get the minutes. But I suppose, generally speaking, it kind of makes sense as a trajectory. I think the country thing is less of an issue. I mean, there's not really anybody in Portugal that could compete with Porto's financial muscle. At that point in time, Monaco were the biggest spending club in France. So, I think from that perspective, it makes sense.
And they're all here to see one man, James Rodriguez, 23 from Colombia. Colombia's star in the Brazil World Cup, but perhaps the star of the Brazil World Cup. And this is the scene at one of the entrances. Just look at all the people queuing down here, queuing to get in to see James Rodriguez.
At what point in his career would you say that James became a known player?
That's a really good question. I mean, arguably, it was after the 2014 World Cup. One of the reasons that I say that is that I think although the move to Monaco was probably that, there was a big fee involved with that. I think it was about £40 million. Still at that point in 2013, 2014, I think European football was probably less covered than it is now. I think players could still move for big fees in between smaller European leagues without necessarily making a massive impact on English football in terms of people being aware of them, people being aware of what they do, how they play, that kind of thing. English football, I think, in terms of its coverage and in terms of its reach, was still relatively parochial, and it wasn't until the explosion of video scouting, Twitter, and also the increased coverage on BT Sport of European football that people really started to sit up and take notice of players that were doing good stuff in other European leagues. So without the international success in 2014, I think he probably still was relatively unknown at that point, even though there was a big fee, even though he was clearly a high-quality player.
In that respect, he's maybe the last player to avoid that boom that you talked about, and were he living his career 10 years later, it might have been completely different for him.
I think that's true. I mean, there's no doubt at all that there would have been enough from his time at Banfield, probably even for him to start becoming a darling of one of the YouTube comps guys. You know, some heavy trance music and him doing back heels and so on. But I think that's one of the things that makes international football interesting, is that it's the opportunity for these players who play either in domestic leagues outside of Europe or in the smaller European leagues to kind of really burst out into the consciousness in a way that now, because everybody's on Twitter and everybody's trying to say that they found the next big thing, you know, these players are much less hidden away than they were previously.
You've already alluded to this, but it's a memorable World Cup in 2014 that really throws him into the public consciousness, at least for British fans of football.
Tell you what's really good about this, Dicko, see from the angle. When it goes over his head again here, watch him here, he has a little look, watch. There it is, look. Now it's coming, and then, you know, to hit one like that, oh, it's just fantastic. Watch it all day.
He wins the Golden Boot for the tournament in that competition, despite Colombia being knocked out in the quarterfinals, and he was also on the 10-man shortlist for the Golden Ball Award, the award for the player of the tournament. How important was this competition for the career of James?
I think it was enormous for two reasons. Firstly, because the World Cup is the ultimate football stage, right? I don't think anyone can deny that, even with the increased importance and financial clout of particularly the Champions League. The World Cup is still the pinnacle, and that was a World Cup in which I think Messi won the Golden Ball Award, but a lot of people felt that James should have done it, so he was putting himself in a bracket with the world's elite players in a very, very public way at that point. Also, I think it's probably what prompted Real Madrid to make him arguably the last genuine Galactico signing before they swooped for Eden Hazard last summer. The way that Real Madrid were approaching transfers, or coming to the end of approaching transfers at that period, was still, let's go out and get the world's best every given year. And without James's performance in that World Cup, it would have been difficult for him to attract that attention. And, you know, I'm not saying that he wouldn't have gone on to get a big move afterwards, but it's no coincidence that he joined Real almost immediately after that World Cup.
From this point onwards, though, it seems as though he never really seemed to settle, and I said that advisedly because I do think there are good periods in his career from this point onwards. He does make over 100 appearances for Real Madrid, but this is over the course of 6 seasons, and 2 of those seasons he spends at Bayern Munich. In fact, the only season he plays more than 30 league games in the course of his career is the single season that he spends at Monaco. What do you think accounts for this flightiness within his career?
It's a fair point, and it's also worth noting that it's only in that first season at Real Madrid, when he's 23, is the last time he played over 50% of available league minutes. I think there are different reasons for this. Obviously, injuries have been a problem for him. He's quite a physically combative midfielder, even though he's not the biggest guy, and he does throw himself into challenges, and I think that accounts for some of his injury problems. I think you also have to look both at Real and Bayern at the other players that were there at the time. So obviously Real have an issue. They sign these massive players. There's pressure on the coach to play them because not only are they a significant financial outlay, but also, you know, it's part of the president's way of saying, look, you know, I'm here and I'm doing good stuff for the club. And obviously that can create internal strife, because a coach may not want to play that player. And James was contesting various positions with world-class players at that point in time. When he went to Bayern again, he did excel in periods at Bayern, but he's kind of a generalist. I think James, his versatility is part of his issue. It's very difficult for you to say he is without question a 10, or without question an inverted 11, or without question an 8. And so when you have teams that either have a very high quality squad or have specialists in any given position, as Bayern did, it's a lot harder to know exactly where to put James. And this is one of the benefits I think that Everton have, is that while the injury issues mean that you may not want to build a team around James's creative abilities, it will be easier for him to slot into a side where he is clearly in the top bracket of quality in that squad. And so nailing his position down will be a lot easier relative to everybody else.
Me gusta mucho la actitud que tiene, es un jugador muy humilde, un chico muy humilde, esto es muy importante. Tener jugador humilde con esta calidad.
This isn't the first time James has played for Carlo Ancelotti. The Italian coached him at Real Madrid through what was probably James' best season at the club. How instrumental do you think this will have been for him deciding to come to Everton?
I think it'd play a very significant part, yes. Everton are a big club in historical terms, but they've not been a challenging club for quite some time. So you then have to look at the other reasons that a footballer would want to come somewhere. I think establishing yourself as arguably the star player on a team, clearly that's quite a significant benefit. Financially, I'm sure James will be very well compensated. But he did thrive under Ancelotti, and Ancelotti respected him enormously as a player, as somebody who worked very hard, as somebody of great technical ability and creative ability. And Ancelotti has this reputation of being quite a kind of fatherly figure, of being somebody who is able to coax really good performances out of his players, who is not so system orientated or tactically rigid that he can't adapt and listen to his players and get I don't want to say collaborative, because Ancelotti is still very much in charge, but I think he's a constructive coach who is able to facilitate his really, really good players rather than to ensure that they do exactly what he says, irrespective of what they want to be doing. So for somebody who is clearly coming to the end of their career at 29, but with significant injury problems behind him, linking up with somebody with whom he has had a really, really good and productive relationship previously will have been a significant incentive to join Everton.
You've just mentioned that James is 29 now. I'm interested in how important this phase of his career will be for his legacy going forward.
There's two answers to this. Firstly, within English football, there is still a very parochial attitude of, if you don't come to the Premier League and prove yourself here, how can we really judge you? And there's only really a couple of, Messi is probably the only player who's escaped that recently, because obviously Ronaldo was in the Premier League, even though he didn't arguably hit heights until he'd left. So there will be a greater degree of respect within the English football community if James succeeds here. But otherwise, I don't know that it can make much of a difference. I mean, if Everton are suddenly propelled to a cup win or something, that will be a significant feather in his cap. But I'm not sure that he's ever really going to be able to do enough to cement some sort of overall legacy in inverted commas.
Are you a fan of football today? Why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full and unedited interviews, and lots more extra content. To join us, just visit patreon.com and search for Football Today. Now back to today's episode. I want to move on now to talk about how James Rodriguez will fit in at Everton. And I suppose the best way of approaching this question is by talking about how Everton play in general. So how would you describe Ancelotti's Everton?
A work in progress? I think Everton are a really, really hard side to understand. Last season, obviously Ancelotti largely used a 4-4-2. He was kind of feeling his way through that season, getting to grips with the players that he had available. I don't know if the 4-4-2 is going to persist in this coming season. Obviously now, with the various options that he's got, particularly if Gabamin comes back from injury, then he could very easily field a 4-3-3. He could field a sort of midfield diamond. He could probably do a Christmas tree formation, which might work quite nicely. So I don't think we'll see a definitive answer to that question until fixtures start on Saturday, because I think Ancelotti was coming to terms with a squad that had been assembled in a relatively haphazard manner. There are definitely some good players there. I think Calvert-Lewin is excellent. Richarlison is very, very good. Luca Dean obviously has excelled at left back. There's talk of getting Tomori on loan, which I think would be really, really good for the defence. John Joe Kenny's coming back from Schalke. He may have a good season. So I think this is the season where we'll see it. And, you know, Everton's business in the transfer window has been geared towards stepping up quality in certain areas. I think central midfield was the area where they were least certain last season of how they wanted to play and what they wanted to do. And by bringing in players in that area particularly, I think it signals that Ancelotti now will have a game plan. Quite what that game plan is, I don't think we'll know until the season starts.
Do you get the sense that the James signing is about the opportunity to sign an elite game-changing player? Or do you think that this is as much about filling a need in the Everton team that already existed?
I think it's both. I think Everton needed an elite game-changing player. In terms of creativity, it wasn't Sigurdsson, it wasn't Gomez, it wasn't Tom Davis. And a lot of the ability in that team creatively came from Richarlison and Calvert-Lewin's ability to link play. So having somebody who can do that from a deeper position, I think, is absolutely crucial. I do also think that in terms of addressing a weakness, you know, we will probably see James line up on either the right-hand side of a 4-4-2 as a kind of inverted playmaking right-sided midfielder, or possibly on either side of a 4-3-3, right or left, and giving that creativity from deeper, somebody who can pick a pass, somebody who is able to change the tempo of a game is something that Everton didn't really have in those positions. You know, Walcott has been playing largely on the right-hand side, and he's very much a use pace to take it down the line and try and sweep it in. So it does give them something different, and I think it does both of those things that you asked. You know, it changes Everton's ability to create from deep, but it also fills a hole because that was a hole.
Let's talk about James Rodriguez in terms of his face value qualities as a footballer. What are the attributes that you bring to mind when you think about James?
First and foremost is just that absolutely glorious left foot. You know, he still has the ability to do things passing-wise that a lot of players don't even see, let alone are able to execute. So there was an assist that he did against Paraguay last year where he dinked it in towards the far post from sort of the top right-hand side of the penalty area with the outside of his left foot, and it curled away beautifully.
Está con ganas, la tiene James de tres dedos y está. ¡Gol de Colombia, Colombia con Luis Fernando Díaz! Gran servicio otra vez como en el partido pasado.
A couple of the assists that he got for Bayern where he kind of almost scooped it up over the defensive line for an on-rushing player. I think it was Müller scored one of them, Vidal scored another.
Slipped through by James Rodriguez and Thomas Müller at the double. James Rodriguez, great ball in for Vidal!
These moments of creativity and trickery are remarkable. Most players can't do them. He also, I think, has two other facets to his game that are quite underrated. When he was at Bayern, particularly playing in this kind of deeper role, he was incredibly willing to be the guy that received the pass, even under pressure. So he was constantly passing and moving, finding space, drifting out of cover shadows, linking the play, facilitating what everybody else around him was doing. You know, in that Bundesliga season where he was playing regularly for Bayern in a 4-3-3, he would quite often get the most touches of any Bayern player during the course of a game, and that's because he wasn't looking to do anything flashy, but he was keeping everything moving for them. I think the other thing that he does really, really well is a horizontal drift when the play is vertical. So in an article that I did for The Athletic recently where I assessed some of his qualities, one of the things that's noticeable is that he is able to cut across the direction of play just to give himself a little bit of extra time, get players to make runs, get players out of cover shadows, that kind of stuff. So he's not afraid to almost stop while everything else moves ahead of him and then play the pass. He's got really good awareness of the tempo of the game around him is, and how if he alters his own tempo, that can create opportunities. And again, that's the mark of a really, really high-quality playmaker.
And modern football, as we know, is becoming increasingly holistic. So what would you say about the defensive side of James' game?
He's actually surprisingly good defensively. He does weigh in with interceptions, tackles. He's a pretty good presser of the ball. If you look at how he stacks up in terms of particularly successful pressures, but also tackles won, he's in the top sort of 40 or 50% of attacking midfielders comfortably. He's not a great one-on-one defender, so he will get dribbled past, but when he can be on the front foot and defend aggressively, I think he'll surprise people with his ability in that regard. You know, Everton are going to want to ensure that whoever plays as a right central midfielder, it'll probably be Alan.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm immensely happy to have been here and signed for Everton.
And whoever plays at right back will give him plenty of cover. And it is interesting that Alan's defensive duties during that really successful Napoli season under Sarri did see him doing an awful lot of defending in the right half space. That does mean that he's kind of naturally adept at covering into that position and doubling up on players with Rodriguez if he plays where we expect him to play. So that I think that could create a really, really good fit on that side. But James is not a brittle, glassy playmaker who's going to shy out of challenges and not get stuck in, which I know is quite a reductive thing to say, but I think he will surprise people with that side of his game. It's also worth noting that he played in Germany for a couple of seasons, and Germany is an intensely aggressive defensive culture with a lot of pressing, and if you're a player who's going to do well over there, you need to buy into that.
You've already mentioned that James is 29. Do you think there's going to be any worries that his age curve is going to come into play in the next few seasons?
Age curve and injury issues, yes. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I said that while he's the kind of player that you would like to build a team around, he's also the kind of player that you might be wary of building a team around. Because, as I said, you know, he's not completed over 50% of league minutes since he was 23. That's a lot of seasons, and while some of that was to do with selection and some of that was to do with the competition from other world-class players in his positions, some of it is definitely to do with injuries. So it's going to be interesting. Ancelotti may take the view that he's the kind of player whose game time and fitness you manage very carefully, and he uses him in games where he feels he can really make a difference rather than him being the first name on the team sheet every week. Having said that, it may be that the more he plays and the fitter he is, the more injury resistant he is. It's difficult to build up consistent periods when you're in and out of teams, and the workload balance is difficult to strike if you're not playing week in, week out. So it may be that under careful management at Everton and playing consistently in the first team, he actually is fitter and less injury prone than we thought.
So how do you anticipate James' time at Everton going?
That's a really difficult question to answer. So I can see lots of personnel reasons why it's a good move, and I think Everton is a club where he can possibly thrive on the basis that there will be high expectations among the Everton fan base of him because he's a significant transfer outlay and he's a really good player, and he's probably the first potentially world-class player that Everton have signed in quite some time. But the overall pressure of playing at that club as opposed to a Manchester United or an Arsenal is less. So I think he will be able to find his groove under a manager that he's obviously worked well with in the past, and he could do really, really well. And I hope he does, because he's probably had a difficult time. I think if you'd asked him, you know, after that World Cup in 2014, what he saw his future as being, you know, establishing himself at one of Europe's top sides and becoming a really regular fit for the next 6, 7, 8 seasons would be what he anticipated for himself, and that hasn't happened. And this is an opportunity for him to remind everybody of how he is an excellent player. And he has been an excellent player in that period, but in fits and starts. And if he can be consistent, then I think he could be a really, really genuinely excellent acquisition.
Alex Stewart is Senior Content Strategist at The Athletic UK and covers tactics for Tifo football. The music in this episode was provided under the Creative Commons licence by Blue Dot Sessions, and all the details for each song can be found in the show notes. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today.